Hello, students. Welcome to week 4. Week 4 is bringing us to chapter 4 in our textbook, which is on human services, identifying problems and causes. And so, as I've said before, each chapter starts off with some questions to consider. And to get started, these questions for chapter 4 are: what types of problems should human services target? What is meant by problem behavior or deviance? How is problem behavior defined from an intrapersonal perspective or as a result of an individual's psychological maladaptation? How is problem behavior defined from an environmental, extrapersonal perspective? And what are the major viewpoints of the causes of problem behaviors? And so the chapter starts off with a little case study to think about. And it talks about, like, if you look at the first sentence of the chapter, it says, in its broadest sense, the term human services can be viewed as an all-encompassing, all-helping services that are aimed at dealing with every human problem. So that makes it really big, right? You know, every possible human problem. And so how do we actually target that down and focus on what needs to be talked about or what needs to be worked on within human services? And so the textbook suggests one possible way of defining the focus of the new field of human services in terms of problem severity. The more severe the problem and the greater risk to the individual, the more likely that that problem falls into the human services sector. And so we're looking at more significant severity as far as problems are concerned and what we'd be looking at. And so human services should deal with problems of psychological or social survival rather than the problems of satisfaction. And so when you think of like, sometimes counselors will do like wellness counseling or wellness coaching or things like that, that would sort of be outside of human services, whereas the human services realm looks at what are the issues of survival, like are the individuals or is the individual dealing with problems related to their basic survival needs or possibly psychological survival. And so how do we identify problems? And it breaks this down between intrapersonal and extrapersonal, sometimes called interpersonal issues. Well, not necessarily. It includes interpersonal issues. That's not the same. But either way, it's two, intrapersonal and extrapersonal. And so the intrapersonal perspective is when you think about the individual themselves. And so everything that lies kind of within them. And so that looks at the biological norms. So, you know, are there problems with some kind of like physical issue or something like that that's related to the biology of the human? So I'm, you know, thinking this would probably include like, you know, genes or, you know, DNA and things like that inside of the person. And so how do those factors cause potential issues in the individual? And so one of the arguments sort of against the biological approach is that it's too reductionist, right? It kind of ignores all of our mental and or all of our you know, psychological kind of stuff and our experiences and our individualistic nature. It's really just looking at the biological factors that impact issues that we could be having. It also doesn't take into account the vast individual differences between the range of structure and function among normal people. And so, you know, that obviously is very individual. We are all unique in our own ways, even though we have a lot of things that, you know, cut across all people or most people. So biological norms could play a role, but don't quite hit the mark, right? There's some weaknesses there. The next is the optimal psychological state. And so this part talks a lot about Maslow, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs is something you may have already heard of. It's something that you're going to be really familiar with. And basically it's sort of like set up like a triangle, and at the bottom are all of the basic things that we need. So like food, water, air, shelter, and it goes up, and at the top is self-actualization, and next are all of the different levels of needs that we might have. And so the idea is that we're not going to be able to reach places towards the top of the pyramid if we haven't satisfied some of those at the bottom. So if a person literally doesn't know when their next meal is coming, they're not going to be as worried about, social belonging and love and all of that when they're like, I just need to survive right now. That's what I'm most focused on. And so Maslow identifies 10 criteria or signs of normal psychological functioning that you can read there. And major criticisms of this is that the definitions of normality are based on value judgments of the theorists who come up with that. So of Maslow's theory, and could be considered somewhat unrealistic, especially for certain individuals. The next is personal discomfort. And so many individuals define or identify themselves as problematic. This identification relates to a subjective sense of personal discomfort. And so it does come from within me whether or not I am, normal. I'm on the range of normality somewhere, or I am problematic. And so the issues and concerns that I have are related to me and who I am. And so this really rests on your personal beliefs, feelings, and thoughts and behaviors, and not necessarily, they kind of focus on how those things within you are not right in some way, and involves a personal value judgment on yourself and maybe even a personal value judgment on others. And so some individuals manifest troublesome behavior that disturbs others more than it actually disturbs them. And so if this was sort of an internal thing, then why might I engage in behaviors that I'm perfectly fine with, but that other people find to be disturbing or problematic or, abnormal? So then when we look at the extrapersonal perspective, it's things outside of ourselves. So we can look at the statistical norms, which really takes into account percentages and percentiles of the population. And so when you look at a bell curve, right, like the very centered, spread out bell curve, that's the normal probability curve. And it was used initially for intelligence. And so if you fell within that tall part, most people are going to fall there within the normal range of intelligence. Whereas if you fell on one end or the other, you had significantly less or more or higher level of IQ or lower level of IQ than other people. There's a number of issues using this kind of normal probability curve in the definition of deviant, abnormal, problematic behavior, because the approach is really focused on the norms within a specific culture, or a specific population, and not necessarily, everyone would fall kind of in those same norms. And so if you think about, comparing a first world country with a third world country, those norms are not going to be the same. And so a second difficulty is that the cutoff points are drawn sort of arbitrarily, like we kind of are like, wow, I think this kind of is where we should end normality and enter the world of abnormality. And that's not always totally accurate, right? There's individual and unique characteristics and differences. You're not sort of like, sick and then this one thing, like data point that makes you suddenly unwell. So there's some question as to whether behaviors are actually normally distributed, right? And so what behaviors we consider normal, do they really fall within this normal probability curve or not? Next is cultural and societal norms. And so norms are standards of behavior that are maintained within individuals or groups. Deviance would, be behavior that varies so far from that group or individual's norms, that if other people knew about it, they would use it as sort of a basis for like ostracizing someone or kind of pushing them to the margins. And this is definitely something that has occurred in our world, in our country, and everything continues to. And then sometimes it becomes codified as law. So if you kind of act in these different ways that don't fit the norms, then it's illegal and you would potentially get into trouble due to that. And so it brings up this term residual rule breaking as a term that describes deviance that's not formally prescribed, but that does violate social norms. So this could be something that's not necessarily illegal in and of itself, but it kind of violates, norms within a group or a culture. And so the example that they give is alcoholism. Many of the behaviors exhibited by people who have mental illness, avoidance of employment by able-bodied people, extreme social isolation, and devil worship, could be considered things that are not socially accepted, but not necessarily outside of the law per se. Also, sometimes by making these sort of labels, people may conform to what they see as that label being. And so maybe they didn't have those specific characteristics or traits, but now that I'm being labeled in this certain way, I'm starting to take them on because that's what's sort of expected of me in some way. In other cases, behavior that is syntonic, accepted and valued to a small culture, may violate the norms of main culture. So for example, being involved in, say, like a gang, there are certain behaviors that are normed within that group, but to outsiders of that group, it's deemed abnormal, if that makes sense. And so the structure of society determines its culture, and the culture strongly influences the thought processes of individuals. Based on this approach, then, an individual who's deviant does not abide by the norms of society. One who abides by the norms of society is not deviant and is considered normal. Criticisms of this approach to define deviance include the concern that society's norms may in themselves be deviant or unacceptable. And so it kind of talks about the Holocaust and the ways in which there was persecution and genocide of Jewish people in Nazi Germany because it was considered to be the norm. That was what was happening, and that's what we need to do. But we wouldn't necessarily say that that was not deviant behavior because we do believe that it was. So the power of shared beliefs that are embedded in a culture are immense. And so that can really have a huge impact when we think about like culture and religious beliefs and things like that impact that. So there are a number of theoretical causes of problem behavior as well that your textbook gets into. First is the intrapersonal perspective. Again, organic causality, which is something inside of us, gives a nice little vignette there of an individual to help explain that. Psychodynamic causality, so we get into Freud a little bit, and oh, and that's it. I thought we got into another theorist in here. But anyway, so that gets into, Freud, his ideas of id, ego, and superego, and the way that they kind of shape our personality and the decisions we make and stuff like that. He talks about it. I mean, your text talks about the different psychosexual stages that Freud thought that we sort of went through. Problem is that there's no actual empirical evidence that supports any of the specific concepts of psychoanalytic therapy. And so it's, sort of I don't want to say widely held, but it's a belief or a theory that's been held by psychology in certain ways and certain perspectives of psychology and stuff like that. But there's not a lot of empirical evidence. The next is psychological causality. This is where we get into Carl Rogers' theory. It sort of explains this more humanistic perspective. There's a couple criticisms of the self theory. It's that it has little hard evidence to sort of suggest that connection, but it is widely endorsed by human services workers and human service programs. And so you're definitely going to learn a lot about this theory and this approach because it seems to work to help people. And under that umbrella is also learning theory. And so this gets a little bit into a couple of approaches. Beck and Bandura And so it gets into social learning theory a little bit. It gets into stimulus response and how that shapes learning. It brings into it cognitive factors. So how do we think about the way that we are learning things? And then Bandura gets more into that social behavioral kind of learning and how we learn from our environments and the people that we're around. So some criticisms to the learning or behaviorist approach is that it's too simplistic. Only the symptoms are dealt with and not necessarily underlying causes. And then there's the extra personal perspective. So again, completely outside of us, right? So cultural, societal causality. And so kind of who am I according to the social environments and cultures that I'm a part of. And so are there labels that are being ascribed to me, like other people in this group or society are kind of putting me in these roles? They're ones that I'm born into, or that some I take on myself and, create kind of or identify with on my own. And how does that then impact how I behave based on those labels that I've either taken on and society's understanding of them, or the labels that have been given to me, and then I act kind of to fall within them or outside of them. Next is cultural variation and role performance. It's the roles that we play and the expectations we have within a certain culture. It gives a little case example there as well. Social conditions essentially lead to maladaptive roles or problematic behavior and lifestyle. Let's see. Basically, the root of problems is within a culture or society. There should be a decrease in the individual deviance seen within members of the culture or society. So if cultural factors change it, then wouldn't we see that effect across the board with individuals within that culture? So it kind of has the limitation there of not seeming to sort of make sense why not everyone would kind of fall into those patterns. And when things in the society are changed, why do we not then see a decrease in that? So it doesn't seem to be easily utilized for explaining extreme deviance of individuals. It seems to accept that the norms of the parent culture as appropriate standard for assessment of deviance, when there could be some wider frame of reference necessary. Next, it gets into the ecological synthesis, the life matrix, which is, there's a depiction of it on page 69. It basically takes all of these different areas that we've talked about and recognize the way that those are interconnected in so many ways, and how that has really the strongest impact and influence on us is the way that these individually impact us and the way they impact each other. And then that kind of complex system impacts us. And so this seems to be sort of the best understanding of it. It is really, more pluralistic, a pluralistic theory, and it allows for more flexibility within the work that we do with individuals. Two basic assumptions are that organisms are interdependent with the environment. So the environment impacts us and we impact the environment, and that interaction patterns are dynamic, adaptive, and reciprocal. It stimulates us to look beyond simple explanations for behavior and explore what interactions may be occurring between variables that result in specific behaviors or social conditions. And it helps us to understand and go beyond the immediate response and more comprehensively deal with major human service social policy issues and where we need to really intervene. So again, there's a nice little summary at the end of the section, some recommended readings, internet sites to check out: the Child Welfare League of America, National Institute on Drug Abuse, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, National Institute of Mental Health, and then connecting with the My Helping Lab if you have that subscription. So that is it for this chapter. I'm looking forward to checking out your discussions for this week. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you. Bye.